Throughout the developing world, people rely heavily on their animals for food, income, and support. Livestock are central to people's livelihoods, and in many rural areas, people's animals are their main asset. When disasters happen, people try to protect their livestock, and after a disaster, people try to rebuild their livestock as a way of recovering. The Livestock Emergency Guidelines and Standards, or LEGS, are a set of international standards to guide the design of livestock projects in humanitarian crises. These crises can happen suddenly, such as floods or earthquakes, or can evolve over many months, such as droughts. Armed conflict is also a major cause of emergencies. Because LEGS are international standards, it's important that the good practices which LEGS describes are based on evidence. This means looking carefully at what types of livestock project work well and why they work well. In other words, we need to collect evidence on the impact of livestock projects, how they benefit animals, and how these benefits translate into better food or income for people. But how do we gather this evidence? Well, one of the main challenges facing humanitarian projects is that it's difficult to find out how people benefited. There is often a lot of activity when a disaster strikes, and aid agencies are busy delivering assistance, often in difficult circumstances. But does this activity really help people who are affected by the disaster, and if so, how? Could the work have been done differently, perhaps to reach more livestock or people, or have greater impacts? There are many ways to improve the impact assessment of livestock projects, but this video will focus on 3 approaches which we've found to be especially useful. Project objectives. Writing the project objectives in ways which clearly show the intended livelihoods impacts. Measuring livestock projects. Using better indicators. Measuring impacts when there is no baseline data. The video will cover each of these 3 approaches in turn. So let's first look at how clear project objectives can help us to measure impact. LEGS is based on the idea that by supporting livestock in emergencies, we assist people who own or use livestock. With this approach in mind, LEGS uses livestock projects to achieve one or more of 3 main livelihoods objectives. We can provide immediate benefits to crisis-affected communities using existing livestock resources, or protect the assets of communities, or support post-disaster recovery. When we design projects with these objectives in mind, we found that people find it easier to measure the impact of the projects if the objectives are clear. Let's take an example of a drought in Ethiopia and an NGO which decides to use supplementary livestock feed as a way to protect the livestock of affected communities. The NGO staff think about the LEGS objectives and can see how their project relates to the second LEGS objective, to protect assets, and the third LEGS objectives, to assist recovery. They then write the following objective for their project: to protect livestock during drought and enhance post-drought recovery. While this gives us a general indication about what the project is trying to achieve, the objective is too vague when it comes to measuring impact. So a better objective might be: in 2 drought-affected districts, reduce mortality by 25% in cattle owned by 50% of the poorest households by the end of the project. If we look closely at this objective, we can see that it's specific because it specifies the project area and the types of livestock and household to be targeted. It's measurable because it defines the geographical area of the project and quantifies the expected impact in terms of reduced mortality and the proportion of households to be reached. It's achievable because the proposed reduction in mortality is based on previous evaluations showing that a 25% reduction in mortality is realistic. It's relevant because it targets the poorest households and is based on the types of livestock owned by these households. And it's time-bound because it specifies that the impact will occur within the life of the project. We call this type of objective a SMART objective because it is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Becoming familiar with SMART objectives and making it normal to write this kind of objective into projects is one of the easiest ways to improve how we assess impact later on. With SMART objectives, it's very clear from the onset what exactly the project is trying to achieve, and project managers can focus on meeting the objective. Here are a few more examples of objectives which can be rewritten and improved to make them SMART. Take a few minutes to look at these and try to draft some stronger objectives which are SMART. The second approach for improving how we measure impact focuses on what we actually measure, or in other words, the indicators we use. In our example of the livestock feed project in Ethiopia, the SMART objective was very clearly to reduce livestock deaths. So, for us to know if we've achieved this objective, the project has to measure the numbers or proportions of animals which survive and die during the project, and record which animals received feed and which didn't. Here, the key indicator for understanding the impact of the project is a mortality indicator, and this is measured in animals receiving and not receiving feed. While it may be possible to measure other indicators during this project, we'd need to be careful not to spend too much time or effort measuring things which don't need to be measured. So a key lesson is to select indicators that are very directly linked to your SMART objectives and don't deviate too much into other indicators. In the feed project, the intention to prevent animal deaths is clearly stated, and so this has to be measured. We also need to compare deaths in animals that receive feed with those that don't. Now, let's look at another aspect of measuring impacts of livestock projects. Imagine a project which responded to a flood in Bangladesh and reports that it has vaccinated 3,000 cattle in the flood-affected area and treated 5,000 cattle with deworming medicines. At first sight, this seems like an impressive project with a lot of cattle vaccinated or treated. But if we think more carefully about impact, then the results become quite difficult to interpret. For example, what if there were actually 100,000 cattle in the area, and all of these cattle were at risk of disease? In this situation, the project vaccinated only 3% of the cattle at risk, and treated only 5%. And if so, the results now seem a lot less promising. What we see here is very common with reports from livestock projects in emergencies, which is the tendency to report activities in terms of numbers of animals receiving assistance, but without mention of the overall population affected or at risk. At this point, some of you will be thinking about the realities on the ground during emergencies and asking how you're supposed to know about livestock populations in the area. We know that it's often impossible and not practical to try to do a proper survey during an emergency, and in some situations, there are no baseline figures on livestock numbers. Even when statistics are available, there is no way of knowing how accurate they are. One way to overcome this problem during impact assessment is to use methods from participatory epidemiology, or PE. These methods are useful in difficult situations because they measure proportions and not actual numbers. For example, instead of trying to measure the exact number of animals receiving veterinary care against a total number of animals, it is possible to measure the percentage of animals using PE methods. We'll look at this in more detail in the third approach for improving impact assessment. Our third and final approach for strengthening impact assessment is to deal with the very common problem of limited or no baseline data on livestock in the project area. Here, we can use PE methods, and so imagine that an impact assessment is done in a village where supplementary feed was used. During the design of the project, discussions were held with livestock keepers, and it was agreed that not all animals could be fed because the project didn't have enough feed to do this. Instead, people selected animals for feeding which were especially valuable, and these were the adult breeding cows. So we have a situation where we had a group of cows which received the feed from the project and a group of cattle of various types which didn't get the feed. The impact of the project depends on the difference in mortality between the two groups. Here we can use a PE method called proportional piling, and the method would work something like this. During the impact assessment, a group of livestock keepers would be first asked to consider all the cattle which didn't get the feed from the project. They'd then be given a pile of 100 counters, such as stones or beans, and told that this pile represents all of the unfed cattle during the project. They'd then be asked to divide the pile into 2 piles to show the pattern of cattle surviving and cattle dying. Note that this is a visual exercise, and the informants provide a visual representation of survivors and deaths using the 100 counters. It might look something like this. If we now count the number of counters, we can get an estimate of mortality in these cattle as follows. In this example, the mortality in these cattle was 30% during the project. The next step is to repeat the exercise, but with the cows which received feed from the project. As before, we use 100 counters to represent these cows and ask people to split the counters into 2 piles to illustrate survivors and deaths. Again, we can get an estimate of mortality which might look something like this, with mortality in the fed cows of 5%. So the proportional piling method has allowed us to estimate cattle mortality in the fed and unfed cattle, but without knowing the cattle population or number of cattle in each group. In this example, the mortality in fed cattle was 25% lower than in unfed cattle. To strengthen the approach, we then need to do 2 things. First, the proportional piling method would need to be repeated in other villages to gather more results on mortality in fed and unfed cattle. This helps to improve the reliability of the figures. We then need to look at the actual amounts and types of feed which the cattle received, and make a technical judgment on whether this feed was likely to be sufficient to prevent starvation during the project. If the amount of feed was very small and way below a basic ration for cows, we wouldn't expect the project to have much impact on cow survival. But if it was a good basic ration, then we'd expect fewer deaths in the fed versus the unfed cattle. We sometimes call this technical plausibility. Using this approach, we can measure impact without baseline data on livestock population. It can also be used for projects which provide veterinary care. The proportional piling method looks easy, but it needs some practice to do well. It also needs to be repeated in different project locations and with different people or groups of people to produce reliable results. Proportional piling has now been very widely used during impact assessment of livestock projects, and is especially useful for measuring livestock mortality in groups of animals which received and didn't receive assistance. This approach is comparable to using a control group in an experiment, because the animals without assistance act as a kind of control. So what we've seen in this video is that it's important for LEGS to understand the impact of livestock projects on people's livelihoods, and for NGOs and donors to gather better information on impact. This can be done by, firstly, writing better objectives during the design of a project which clearly show the expected results on people's livelihoods. Secondly, by measuring activities and impact using meaningful indicators which refer to livestock populations which need assistance. And thirdly, by using the methods of participatory epidemiology to measure changes in animals which receive project assistance versus those which don't. Thank you for watching. For more information about these approaches, please visit the LEGS website.